Alright guys, Ian here from Surrey Sports Therapy. Hope you're safe, hope you're well. So we're back with Injury of the Week. And this week we're just looking at posture. We've actually got sort of two cases we're going to look at, and we're going to use them to redefine what we actually mean by posture. So let's hit the intro. Okay, so posture. What do we actually mean by posture? If I was to ask you to show me a good posture, you'd find a sort of fairly kind of static position, right? So you'd probably sort of sit up nice and tall, shoulder blades would kind of come back, possibly chin would sort of tuck a little bit. And that's all fine as regards posture, and I think that that's a really important position to kind of start from. The issue is that it doesn't really talk about the sort of dynamic environment that we live in, right? So actually in reality, when we sort of talk about posture, we move around kind of quite a lot. The other idea about posture that we want to sort of look at today is this idea that posture is purely a sort of shoulder, sort of thoracic position, and posture is actually is better related to all joints in both static and dynamic sort of settings. So case number one we're going to look at. This is a patient I've been seeing for sort of quite a while, and with them, they've got a very kind of fixed ideal of what posture is. So posture for them is a single position that they try to hit. And if they can't hit that position for whatever reason, maybe it's the sort of structure of the world around them, maybe it's that they're a little bit tight, maybe it's a little bit sore, whatever it is, they fight to try to hit that position, which is fine. Certainly when they're sort of sat at their desk, that definitely kind of makes sense. The issue is that because there is that fight kind of going on, and they're not accepting the position, or the posture as a position is a dynamic, is a changeable sort of ideal, they're constantly fighting for that position, right? So, for example, when we've got them sort of sat at their desk, they do a lot of sort of work, obviously, on the computer, got a separate mouse. They've been kind of coming to me for a little while with a little bit of sort of general kind of right shoulder positional issue, right? So nothing kind of necessarily structurally wrong, so much as all of those structures that are stabilizing and sort of mobilizing and, working that whole shoulder girdle, are having a bit of a sort of internalized fight, right? So when they're sat at their desk, obviously hand on that right mouse, what generally tends to happen is that right hand kind of gets away from them a little bit. And what this sort of ends up with them having is that right shoulder in a slightly awkward position. You would refer to it as suboptimal, but in reality it's just the confines of that as a sort of position, right? What they do then to kind of counteract that is they fight to kind of get that shoulder to kind of come back, right? Perfectly fine. You kind of go, that's understandable. We want to kind of, not have that shoulder floating away. We want to have it back in sort of underneath us a little bit. The issue is that lat then starts to become very hyperactive. And we start to move away from the sort of, lower strength, lower load sort of stabilizers and move more towards the sort of bigger load mobilizers. So what we're finding is actually those bigger mobilizer structures are just on 24/7, right? So lats are on, pecs are on, and that's then causing, again, a sort of additional kind of postural issue. So one of the things we're kind of looking at with them is really redefining what they are looking for in terms of posture. So moving away from posture is this position and no other position, and actually much more using the ideals of that singular postural position to sort of ally for posture in the dynamic sense, right? So we're basically looking at sort of three kind of structures that we're basically trying to balance. So we're trying to balance sternum position, we're trying to balance scapular position, so scapular retraction, and we're trying to balance chin position. With the ideal that actually that's a movable target, right? So we're looking at a balance between the three, not specific position of each one. The example that we kind of gave them is like doing a deadlift, right? So if we think about a deadlift position from that set position on the floor, we can kind of set everything kind of in a nice place, right? It's a fairly static position. We can set sternum height, so thoracic extension. We can set scapular retraction, and we can set chin position. Now, halfway through that lift, we may well actually start to lose that chin position as we're fighting for scapular, thoracic extension and also scapular retraction, right? Whereas up at the sort of top of the lift, we can stack cervical spine, so we can stack chin position, we can stack thoracic position, so we can be nicely extended, nice and upright. But because of the confines of the bar, we might be a little bit more protracted than what we would be normally. Now, none of those positions are detrimental. None of those positions are abnormal. None of those positions have any negative effect on that lift. But if you were to take each one as defined by our sort of optimal optimal posture, you'd say that each one was correct. But this again is that idea of sort of putting what we understand, what we think about a posture in a static sense, and moving into the sort of dynamic sense. And with that, accepting that we're not going to be always in one position. And in doing so, we allow ourselves to kind of calm everything down a little bit, be less rigid in terms of our sort of recruitment pathway for certain structures, and actually be able to be in a more relaxed position more of the time. There are still going to be sort of times in which we have to kind of fight a little bit for that position if we don't have the recruitment strength, if we don't have the requisite kind of mobility, if you think about thoracic extension mobility, for example. But you're going to be in a sort of much more relaxed posture more of the time, which means we're less likely to see patients with a lot of tension through certainly sort of scapular retractors, for example, because we have less of that external unit on, so less lats on, less pecs on. They're not doing the stability work, and they're allowing all of the more stabilizing structures to actually do their job. Okay, so case number 2 is a foot issue, which seems kind of quite bizarre when we start to talk about posture, right? Because posture is just about shoulders, right? But as I say, this is that idea of sort of moving what we talk about when we talk about posture onto other structures. So this patient is, amongst other things as regards their foot, struggles in terms of good arch shape, right? So i.e. their arch sits a little bit flat. Now, the idea of describing people as being very flat-footed or having, I suppose, excessive pronation, all things like that, that's a whole other video of itself, and I'm not going to go into that. But fair to say that they don't have good motion control or static stance control of their arch. Now, there are varieties of different reasons sort of for that, and obviously sort of tibialis posterior strength is kind of part of one of them, which is part of their sort of rehab process. But more broadly, we're sort of looking at how they stand on one foot and can they control arch position, right? So can they make a nice arch shape whereby their first MTP, so the ball of the big toe, that joint is loaded. They are evenly loaded then through the heel. So i.e. we're not in, we're not out in any way, shape or form. And they are still able to wiggle their toes, which is really important. So we're stood kind of quite balanced across the foot in a way in which we still have a nice arch shape. It's got me kind of thinking is that, that in itself is posture, right? So this idea that posture, again, when we look at feet, we generally tend to look at it in quite a static sense. So we look at, can you stand? Whether that be standing on 2 feet, standing on 1 foot. But we don't really sort of approach it quite so much in a dynamic sense, right? Now, when we do, obviously we look at it, on sort of force platforms, we look at it in terms of just eyeing kind of what's kind of going on. But then when we try to address it, so with like orthotics or similar, again, we're addressing it back into the static sort of concept. So I think for me, one of the things with sort of foot posture, foot strength, foot position, foot shape, again, is trying to move the patient into more of a dynamic setting. So, like with this patient, we've got them sort of standing, looking in the mirror, getting a load of sort of feedback, having a load of sort of pressure feedback as regards, we're kind of cueing what they should be feeling through their feet. In both a sort of double leg stance and also a single leg stance. But the idea is actually to move them into application of that in a more dynamic sense, right? So it's understanding kind of cueing how their foot is hitting the floor, cueing how they are transferring weight through the foot, cueing how they are leaving the floor. So what part of the foot is pushing off of the floor. One of the issues with this patient is that they sort of roll off the outside of the foot. So rather than rolling through the sort of big toe, they push off and roll outside. So one of the cues we'll sort of move on to with them is very much a sort of very positive engagement with the sort of big toe, right? So again, getting them to work across onto the big toe and then push off the big toe. Which obviously again is that whole idea again of a static posture, a dynamic posture, taking elements of what we're looking at from a static posture. So when we talk about static posture for the foot, as I say, positive engagement of the ball of the big toe on the floor. Why? Well, that then allows us to then make sure that we can get onto the big toe. And if we can get onto the big toe, we can then push off the big toe. So again, we can then cue that. So again, in much the same way as we're talking about sort of shoulder posture, scapular posture, thoracic posture, neck posture, as being yes, a static sort of ideal, but taking it then into the sort of dynamic sort of setting and trying to balance those three. It's the same as regards to a structure like your foot, whereby we can assess it statically. We set the feedback loop in a static setting, and then ideally what we should be doing is moving that patient into a more dynamic setting, but keeping those sort of same cues. So keeping those same ideals, making sure we're understanding, okay, at each stage of the sort of walking gait, what is the foot meant to be doing? What structures are meant to be on? What structures are meant to be off? What structures are meant to be loading? What should the patient be feeling? So what's the feedback from there? And then cueing them appropriately. Okay, so we've actually got an accompanying blog post to kind of go with this. So obviously double check our website and obviously let us know your sort of comments below. Obviously if you are a therapist, if you work with patients and or if you're a patient yourself, possibly sort of struggling with some postural issues or anything like that, again, let us know. Let us know your thoughts on posture. Let us know your thoughts on, again, this idea of sort of moving from a less rigid, static sort of posture and moving more towards sort of dynamic posture. But that's us for this time. Don't forget to like, follow, comment, subscribe, etc., etc., etc. Hope you stay safe and well. See you next time.